When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Third Reich completely collapsed. The German cities were destroyed, the Nazi leaders were arrested or disappeared, and the structure of the regime crumbled without leaving any functioning part behind. While Europe was divided into occupation zones and the Allied authorities organized judicial processes, there was a less visible part of the story: the family members of Adolf Hitler. Brothers, nephews, and relatives tried to adapt to a new scenario marked by a power vacuum, isolation, and rejection. Some left the country, others changed their names, and many chose to disappear from the public eye. The surname represented a burden that none of them could escape, even if they stayed away from politics or social attention. Is it possible to completely distance oneself from the past when carrying the most famous surname of the 20th century? Berlin in ruins, the final breach of the Nazi Empire. On the 2nd of May in 1945, Berlin fell completely under Soviet control. The divisions of the Red Army had advanced block by block, securing administrative buildings, stations, and communication networks. The remaining German army troops, exhausted, finally signed the surrender. The streets were covered with collapsed bricks, persistent smoke, immobile tanks, and charred remains of vehicles. The wounded were transported in improvised wheelbarrows, while prisoners were grouped in squares and parking lots for their later transfer to detention camps. The civilian population slowly emerged from air raid shelters and basements turned into burrows. Women, the elderly, and children wandered disoriented among the rubble, searching for water, some food, or traces of missing family members. The stores had been looted, the hospitals overwhelmed, and the train stations disabled with destroyed tracks and overturned carriages. In the distant neighborhoods, farmers displaced by the fighting sought shelter among the few houses still standing. In the center of Berlin, all official symbols had disappeared. No flags, no signs, no intact offices. What had once been the capital of an empire was now only a smoky shadow. In the following days, the Soviets set up checkpoints at every major intersection. They imposed curfews, restrictions on nighttime movement, and house-to-house searches. Men between the ages of 15 and 60 were called to report to the military authorities. Women were given specific instructions to protect essential goods and prevent looting. The soldiers marked the homes based on their occupancy status and secured key buildings like stations, depots, and administrative centers. The rations distributed were minimal: black bread, potatoes, small cans of preserved food. The lines to obtain them stretched for hours under the armed supervision of Soviet soldiers. The medical centers could barely attend to the wounded, many suffering from infections, fractures, and diseases due to the terrible hygiene conditions. The morgues were full, and many bodies were buried in makeshift mass graves in parks and abandoned lots. Meanwhile, the Allied powers began meetings to organize the provisional administration of the city. Berlin was divided into Soviet, American, British, and French sectors. The demarcation lines were drawn on war maps, backed by diplomatic agreements and troop movements. Documents from the former Nazi government were gathered, stored, and analyzed in detail in depots under international supervision. Investigations into war crimes, administrative responsibilities, and hidden networks progressed alongside the minimal reconstruction of basic services. The collapse was visible at every corner. Public transportation didn't work, phone lines remained silent, and electricity was only restored in a few priority areas. Semi-destroyed churches served as temporary shelters for homeless families. The parks were filled with makeshift tents, where displaced people tried to survive the harsh conditions. The civil registries reopened to update births, deaths, and forced displacements, while lines of citizens waited patiently to be documented. The military authorities were not only advancing in territorial control, but also in the systematic collection of data. It was crucial to identify which members of the former regime were still hiding, which direct relatives remained, and which clandestine structures might have survived the collapse. Intelligence teams began cross-referencing lists, preparing interrogations, and mobilizing undercover agents. Rebuilding didn't just mean clearing rubble, but also dismantling the last remnants of a fallen power structure. The numbers were overwhelming and painful. More than 92,000 Soviet soldiers died during the Battle of Berlin, many in hand-to-hand combat, advancing meter by meter between barricades and fortified positions. The German casualties exceeded 80,000, including both frontline soldiers and volunteers from the Volkssturm, youth militias, and civilian defenders. Between 120,000 and 150,000 civilians lost their lives during the final battles, victims of bombings, fires, and harsh reprisals. The sources varied in details, but all agreed on reflecting the magnitude of the human cost. The streets, hospitals, and makeshift cemeteries became silent witnesses to a war that had devastated the population and destroyed essential infrastructure. In the following days, the Allied troops occupied their respective sectors as agreed upon in the Yalta and Potsdam agreements. British, American, and French soldiers patrolled the assigned areas under strict protocols to avoid accidental clashes with the Soviets. The flags of each power flew on official buildings, marking the beginning of a joint occupation that, despite the agreements, already showed the first political tensions between the future opposing blocs. Administrative decisions passed into the hands of the Allies, while the civilian population sought to survive amidst the ruins, fear, and uncertainty. The final battle was not only a military confrontation, but also a symbolic clash. Berlin was not just a defeated city, it was the center of the power that had dominated Europe for over a decade, the stage from which a machinery of conquest and extermination had been projected. Now, its material ruins were visible to all, but the social, political, and human ruins were even deeper. The work ahead didn't just consist of clearing rubble or rebuilding buildings, but of reconstructing a shattered society, redefining a broken national identity, and confronting scars that would remain open for generations. Thus, Berlin became the living symbol of the collapse of an empire, trapped between the wounds of the past and the harsh realities of the future. The final hours of the bunker. At the end of April in 1945, the situation in Berlin had completely collapsed. The Soviet forces were advancing through the last sectors of the city, occupying buildings, streets, and bridges at an overwhelming pace, with no organized resistance left. The remnants of the Nazi leadership were still trapped in an underground complex beneath the gardens of the Chancellery, where officials, assistants, administrative staff, and key figures remained. Above, the city was shattered. Supplies were scarce, communications were cut off, and the morale among those present was fading, marked by a thick silence and weary eyes that avoided meeting. In the bunker, the final days passed between reports of lost territory and desperate messages from isolated units that barely managed to convey their situation. The inner circle of the leader was preparing political and personal documents organizing the succession and last logistical instructions. Explosions constantly shook the walls, shaking dust from the ceilings, while some assistants reviewed papers that would have otherwise been reserved only for official dispatches. The atmosphere was tense, thick, loaded with a mix of resignation and nervousness that could be felt in the narrow hallways. On the 29th of April, a private ceremony took place between two people from the leader's inner circle. At the same time, administrative measures were confirmed to ensure the transition of responsibilities in the event of a final collapse. The following hours were occupied by small meetings, exchanges of messages, and tasks distributed among those who remained there. Outside, the Soviet columns were already extremely close, shaking the ground of the bunker with repeated bursts that felt like dry blows underfoot. In the streets, Berlin was completely fragmented. The defenses acted without central coordination, each group following disjointed orders. Some forces tried to retreat to less exposed areas, while others sought to open routes to the west to surrender to the Anglo-American allies, believing that there they would find a less brutal fate. The access to the underground shelter was blocked, and there was no way to send messengers or establish reliable external contact. On the 30th of April, the decisions made earlier were carried out. The signed documents became effective, and leadership passed into the hands of those designated as successors. Inside the bunker, assistants organized the final movements, while outside, the Soviet troops were taking building after building. Although the sounds of gunfire and explosions continued to be heard nearby, the command center had ceased to function as an operational structure. From the 1st of May, the remnants of the German command attempted to send messages to other areas, using the few remaining communication lines. Contacts were sought to negotiate partial surrenders or transmit instructions to remote zones. However, the responses were incomplete and often never arrived, swallowed by the chaos of the final hours. When the Soviet troops entered the Chancellery in the following days, they found the premises empty, with clear signs of a hasty abandonment. Burned documents, overturned furniture, traces of hurried movements that spoke of a chaotic withdrawal. The fall of Berlin marked the functional end of the government that had led Germany since 1933. The last surrenders were formalized between the 2nd and 3rd of May, signed at different points according to local fronts. On the 7th of May in Reims, the unconditional surrender was sealed before the Western Allies. The next day in Berlin, it was completed before the Soviet forces. With this, the war in Europe officially ended, although some minor clashes persisted for a few hours before the final ceasefire was ordered. After the occupation, detailed inspections were carried out in the official buildings, checking every room, every archive, and every depot. They searched for clues about the final decisions of the ruling circle, possible strategic documents, contact lists, escape routes. What they found were torn papers, destroyed furniture, and disconnected fragments of administrative materials. The occupying authorities attempted to reconstruct what had happened, but the information shared publicly was limited, carefully managed. Meanwhile, the Allied services began a parallel task, locating the relatives of the missing leader. Although many had not held official positions, it was crucial to identify them to prevent them from becoming symbols for potential underground networks or resistance movements. Civil records, immigration documents, and statements from former acquaintances were traced. Some relatives had already fled, others were waiting to be interrogated. Several had changed their names before the collapse, anticipating the consequences to come. The decisions made by these relatives showed they fully understood the severity of the collapse. The original surname was modified, hidden, or removed from records, becoming a mark that few wanted to retain. Over the following years, journalists, investigators, and intelligence agencies tried to track them down, but they only managed to piece together scattered fragments, loose pieces of a family puzzle. Name changes, relocations to remote places, and silence pacts sealed in private ended up hiding the traces, leaving barely minimal marks in old documents and indirect accounts. The sinking of the Nazi government not only closed a political chapter, but also slowly but relentlessly erased a family network that, with the passage of years, would be relegated to the margins of history, dissolving among torn papers, anonymous graves, and memories no one wanted to keep alive. Alois Hitler Jr., the missing brother. Alois Hitler Jr., the older half-brother of Adolf Hitler, was born in 1882, the result of his father, Alois Hitler Sr. SS' first marriage to Franziska Matzelsberger. From a young age, he showed a problematic character. As a teenager, he left the family home after repeated conflicts with his father, an authoritarian man with a harsh demeanor. For years, Alois Jr. traveled throughout Austria and Germany, working in various occupations, until he finally settled in Ireland and later in England. In 1900, Alois met Bridget Dowling, an Irish woman whom he married and settled with in Liverpool. The couple had a son, William Patrick Hitler, in 1911. However, the marriage was not stable. Alois abandoned his family in 1913 and returned to Germany, where he started a new life with another woman, Hedwig Heidemann, with whom he had another son, Heinz, in 1923. This second household was built on a fragile foundation, as Alois never legally divorced Bridget, becoming a bigamist in the eyes of the law. During the years of the Nazi regime, Alois Jr. was not part of the close political circle. Although he was the half-brother of the party leader, he did not hold relevant positions or have a significant public presence. He focused on business activities, mainly in the hotel and restaurant sector. In Berlin, he ran a restaurant known as Alois near Wittenbergplatz, a business he acquired under questionable circumstances after its previous Jewish owner was stripped of it under the racial persecution laws imposed by the regime. Despite this direct benefit, Alois did not enjoy a close relationship with Adolf. The bond between them was distant, marked by distrust and a lack of affection. There are no records indicating frequent family meetings or Alois's participation in official party celebrations. The relationship was defined primarily by caution. Alois led a parallel existence, away from media exposure. The Allied advance and the imminent fall of the regime in 1945 put Alois in a compromised position. Businesses linked to the regime became exposed, and interrogations regarding the direct beneficiaries of expropriations intensified. Alois was arrested by British authorities in Hamburg in August of 1945. However, after reviewing his record, it was determined that he had not been actively involved in political decisions or party structures. He was not a member of the Nazi organizations, nor did he hold a military rank. He was released the same day. After his release, Alois lived a completely discreet life. He changed his last name to Hiller, a barely noticeable variation, and sought refuge in anonymity. He lived with his wife Hedwig until his death in 1956 in Hamburg. His final years were spent in silence, with no known contact with other family members. He left no public testimony or statements about his relationship with Adolf, and no personal documents revealed political positions or private reflections on the historical events surrounding him. His son Hines Hitler, from the second marriage, had a different fate. He was recruited by the Hitler Youth, became an enthusiastic supporter of the regime, and ended up dying as a Soviet prisoner of war in 1942 at the age of 19. Alois, in contrast, navigated the conflict without direct involvement. His activities were limited to private business and the indirect benefits his kinship provided, without engaging in the power operations that defined the period. After his death, Alois was buried in the Ohlsdorf cemetery in Hamburg. Although the concession of his grave is registered under his name, there is currently no marker or headstone visible to indicate its exact location. The family's decision was to keep the place anonymous, removing any reference that could attract curiosity or unwanted attention. Practical decisions marked the history of Alois Hitler Jr. Without public statements, personal writings, or a constructed memory, his figure slowly dissolved into the archives, leaving only a record of his existence, his movements, and his deliberate disappearance from the public space. To this day, he remains one of the names on the family tree, without active descendants or direct presence in the main historical narratives, but always linked by bloodline to one of the most studied and controversial figures in contemporary history. William Patrick Hitler, the rebel nephew. William Patrick Hitler was born in Liverpool in 1911, the son of Alois Hitler Jr. and Bridget Dowling. From a young age, he grew up in an environment marked by the absence of his father, who abandoned the family in 1913 to return to Germany. Raised by his mother in England, William Patrick had an ordinary childhood, far from the political events that would soon transform Europe. In the late 1920s, he became interested in the figure of his uncle, Adolf Hitler, who was already an influential figure in Germany. He decided to travel to that country to explore opportunities, seeking family connections that could facilitate his social or professional rise. During his visits, he tried to establish himself in jobs related to the regime's environment. Adolf Hitler received him on a few occasions, but always maintained a cold and distrustful attitude. Although William Patrick managed to secure minor jobs in companies linked to the party, his behavior was perceived as opportunistic, which caused discomfort among officials in the inner circle. Finally, due to the lack of support, he returned to England in 1938. Shortly afterward, he embarked on a trip to the United States, where his surname immediately sparked media interest. Becoming a public curiosity, he began giving lectures and interviews in which he narrated his family experience and described the environment of the Nazi regime from his personal perspective. The United States' entry into World War II in December of 1941 opened a new chapter in his life. William Patrick requested to join the US Navy, and after overcoming initial doubts due to his surname, he was accepted. He served actively during the conflict, reaffirming his distance from the German branch of the family. At the end of the war, he decided to permanently settle in the United States. He changed his surname to Stuart Houston, removing the visible link to his family history. He settled in Long Island, New York, where he worked in a medical laboratory and organized a reserved life centered on his immediate surroundings. He married Phyllis Jean-Jacques, a German woman with whom he had 4 children: Alexander, Louis, Brian, and Howard. The family maintained a discreet routine, avoiding the use of the original surname and keeping a distance from the family origins. None of the children left descendants, following a shared decision that limited the continuity of the lineage. In the years that followed, William Patrick avoided contact with the media, did not give interviews, nor wrote memoirs. References about his life come from official documents, immigration records, military files, and some indirect testimonies. He never publicly expressed opinions about his uncle or the regime to which he was linked by blood. In 1987, he passed away after a long illness. He was buried under the adopted name Stuart Houston in Long Island. The place does not include any marker indicating his historical relation or references that connect him to the past. The family decided to maintain a low profile even after his death, thus closing a chapter that was only recorded in the scattered traces of civil documentation. the children and the family pact. Alexander, Louis, Brian, and Howard were born in the United States, the children of William Patrick Hitler and Phyllis Jean-Jacques. From childhood, they grew up using the surname Stuart Houston, a name adopted by their parents to eliminate any direct connection to their family history. Raised in Long Island, New York, they lived integrated into the local community, far from curious eyes and public interest. In their home, the European past was never a topic of conversation. The brothers knew that their original surname carried a weight that was difficult to erase, but they received clear instructions: maintain discretion, avoid exposure, and protect their private lives. None of them had children. Although they never offered a public explanation for this decision, close individuals claimed that there was an implicit agreement not to continue the lineage. Alexander, the oldest, was born in the early 40s. He became interested in educational topics and worked as a social worker. He was described as a close person with a sense of humor. Among the brothers, he was the one who developed the most community-oriented profile. Those who knew him saw him as kind, with no visible signs that reminded anyone of his family origins. Louis and Brian, the middle brothers, started a gardening business together on Long Island. Over time, they gained a reputation as serious traders, always maintaining a reserved existence. They shared the family home and reinforced their social isolation, avoiding interviews, public photos, or any interaction that would attract attention. Howard, the youngest, had a brief life. He died in 1989 at the age of 32 in a car accident. He was remembered by friends as a creative and friendly young man, active in school activities, particularly in the local high school band. His death was a significant blow to the brothers who, according to indirect accounts, strengthened their decision to remain distant even further. For decades, the brothers rejected any exposure. They left no traces in the media, did not participate in documentaries, nor wrote memoirs. They avoided journalists and did not respond to attempts of contact from historians or researchers. Their names did not appear in public records connected to the original surname, and their residence was protected by simple but effective measures, such as high fences and plant barriers to prevent external gazes. The decision to maintain the surname Stuart Houston was decisive in erasing any public link. Although official records and local archives confirmed their presence in Long Island, historical documents did not include them as visible descendants of the Hitler family. They lived ordinary lives, working, paying taxes, and participating discreetly in their environment, without leaving public traces of their origin. The available images of them are few and come from school yearbooks or youthful photos. None of the three surviving brothers appear in recent photos or offered statements to the press. The only exception was Alexander, who, in a casual meeting with a foreign documentarian, briefly confirmed that the family had decided not to speak or collaborate with projects linked to their past. The story of Alexander, Louis, Brian, and Howard is reflected only in civil documents, school records, and some scattered testimonies. They never offered public accounts nor tried to justify their silence. They lived away from cameras, reports, and questions, following a shared commitment that accompanied them until the end. Paula Hitler, the forgotten sister. Paula Hitler was born in 1896 in Austria, the daughter of Alois Hitler and Clara Pölzl. She was the youngest of the surviving children from the marriage. During her childhood, she led a peaceful life compared to the tumultuous existence of her half-brother Adolf, who from a young age sought to stand out in Vienna and later in Munich. Paula kept herself apart from political and artistic circles, focusing her life on simple activities far from the public eye. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, Paula adopted a discreet profile. She did not participate in the activities of the regime nor hold influential positions. Although she acknowledged her family connection, she kept her distance from the official structure. She lived in Vienna, working in administrative jobs and surviving on a modest salary. During the years of the Third Reich, Paula was not a public figure. Unlike other family members, she never attempted to leverage her family ties to gain privileges. She remained practically invisible to the media and the propaganda apparatus. Official records of the time mention her only in internal family references, without assigning her any significant role. After the fall of the regime in 1945, Paula was located by the Allied authorities in Austria. She was arrested for interrogation and remained in custody for several weeks. Investigations determined that she had not been involved politically, nor had direct contact with the administration of the Nazi government. She was released without charges and returned to a private life. From that moment, Paula lived under the surname Wolf, a variation used to protect her identity. She moved to the town of Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, where she resided in modest conditions. She never married nor had children. Her financial resources mainly came from a small pension and the occasional sale of personal mementos. In the years following the war, Paula avoided giving interviews. The few times she spoke with journalists were brief and focused only on childhood family memories, with no comments on the political events or the figure of her brother. She never wrote memoirs, nor left extensive testimonies that would have allowed her thoughts on the historical period she lived through to be reconstructed. Neighbours in Berchtesgaden described her as a solitary, reserved woman who spent most of her time at home. She did not actively participate in the social life of the town, nor maintain close relationships outside her immediate circle. Over time, her figure became surrounded by almost total silence. Paula Hitler died in 1960, at the age of 64. She was buried in the local cemetery under the surname Wolf, with no inscription revealing her family connection. The grave, simple and unadorned, remained for years as an anonymous place, visited only by a few curious people who knew its exact location. Her story was recorded only in judicial files, administrative documents, and some indirect testimonies from neighbours and acquaintances. Like other members of the family, she chose a path of absolute discretion, avoiding any public reconstruction of her personal history. Hines Hitler, the young soldier. Heinz Hitler was born in Germany in 1923, the son of Alois Hitler Jr. and Hedwig Heidemann. He was the half-brother of William Patrick Hitler, although their lives took completely different paths. While William grew up in England under the surname Hitler, Heinz was raised in Germany, immersed in an environment of growing nationalist fervour. From a young age, Heinz was influenced by the youth organisations of the regime. He joined the Hitler Youth, where he stood out for his enthusiasm and commitment. Unlike other family members who maintained a distant relationship with the political structure, Heinz became an open advocate for the official ideology, actively participating in formative activities and the indoctrination programs organized by the party. When World War II broke out in 1939, Heinz, like many young Germans, was recruited to serve on the front lines. He was assigned to a communications unit on the Eastern Front, where he carried out technical duties. During this time, he was exposed to the harsh conditions of combat, facing extreme cold, lack of resources, and constant danger on the front lines. In 1942, at the age of 19, Heinz was captured by Soviet forces during an operation in Russian territory. After being captured, he was transported to a prisoner of war camp, where he remained under severe conditions. There are no detailed records of the interrogations or the specific treatment he received, but historical sources agree that he died under Soviet custody that same year. The news of his death did not make a media impact in Germany. Although he was part of the Hitler family, Heinz was not a public figure, nor did he hold any significant position in the regime's hierarchy. For his father, Alois, the loss was a personal blow, though there are no known testimonies regarding the emotional impact. After the end of the conflict, the Allied authorities included Heinz in the lists of direct family members who would undergo investigations. However, once his death on the front was confirmed, no further actions were taken. Official records identify him as one of the members of the Hitler family who died in active military service, with no political connections or responsibilities. Heinz was buried in a mass grave on Soviet territory. There is no identifiable individual grave, nor was any commemorative monument erected. His name only appears in official wartime casualty records, without notable references. Over time, his figure was reduced to an archival note, without descendants, without direct impact on the later historical reconstruction, and without a personal voice in family accounts. Heinz's story is the only documented case of a direct family member of Adolf Hitler who died in combat during the conflict. His journey is recorded exclusively in military documents, prisoner files, and casualty lists, with no memoirs or personal testimonies to reconstruct his thoughts or perception of the historical events he lived through. The end of the surname and the closure of the legacy. At the end of World War II, the surname Hitler became definitively associated with one of the darkest episodes of the 20th century. The descendants faced a unique dilemma: keep the name, transform it, or erase it completely from their lives. Unlike other surnames linked to historical figures, this one became globally synonymous with destruction and violence. The close relatives who survived chose to disappear from the public eye. Paula Hitler, Adolf's younger sister, lived under the surname Wolf. William Patrick Hitler, the nephew born in England, adopted the surname Stuart Houston in the United States. Alois Hitler Jr., the older half-brother, changed his surname to Hiller when he settled in Germany after the regime's collapse. None of these changes were imposed. All were personal decisions to distance themselves from the weight of the past. In the United States, William Patrick formed a family with Phyllis Jean-Jacques. They had 4 children: Alexander, Louis, Brian, and Howard. The siblings grew up using the surname Stuart Houston and lived completely removed from the media. None had descendants, following what those close to them described as a silent agreement to end the family line. Although there was no formal document confirming this, the practical outcome was clear. The direct lineage ended with them. Alexander, the oldest, worked as a social worker and was known for his reserved and friendly character. Louis and Brian, the middle brothers, ran a gardening business together on Long Island. They built high fences around their home and avoided social life, although some neighbors described them as courteous in daily interactions. Howard, the youngest, passed away in 1989 at the age of 32 in a car accident. None sought public attention or participated in media projects. In Germany, Alois Hitler Jr. lived until 1956. His son Hines died on the Eastern Front in 1942 without leaving heirs. The German family branch thus ended without direct descendants. The distant branches, such as those of distant cousins, were never the subject of attention or official studies. The surname Hitler was erased from later family records. Searches conducted in recent decades by researchers found no proof of living descendants bearing the name or attempting to recover it. In the United States, William Patrick's children lived discreetly, working in small local businesses, avoiding interviews, and rejecting any contact from those trying to learn details about their family past. The family silence served to stay away from public attention and allowed them to build new lives, free from the inherited burden. Records show that after 1945, the relatives chose common occupations, working as employees or merchants without using their origins to gain advantages. Over time, the line faded away. The death of William Patrick in 1987, Howard in 1989, and Phyllis in 2004 left Alexander, Louis, and Brian as the only survivors. The 3, according to public records, continued living on Long Island, maintaining their commitment not to have children and avoiding any exposure. To this day, there is no public evidence of living descendants who carry the original surname or attempt to revive it. The closure of the line was not formalized by law, but it represented a biological and social end. The surname still exists in historical documents, academic analyses, and books, but it is no longer part of the private lives of those who once bore it. None of the relatives wish to revisit that history, and their trace remains in local archives and cemeteries without monuments or visible plaques. Adolf Hitler's descendants disappeared from subsequent generations, leaving only scattered records. The remote relatives and the shadow of a surname. Beyond the direct relatives, the Hitler family included collateral branches in Austria and Germany. These lines, formed by cousins, distant nephews, and descendants of half-siblings from previous generations, were outside the immediate interest of the press, although some researchers attempted to trace their paths. Civil records in Austria mention variations of the surname, such as Hitler and Hitler, which appear in documents from the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, these records do not prove clear connections to Adolf Hitler's core family. In the decades following the war, no distant descendants sought to establish connections or reclaim the surname. Sporadic mentions in the press of supposed living relatives in rural areas of Austria or small German towns were never confirmed with solid evidence. The archives show that several members of these branches emigrated before World War II, particularly to North America. Some modified their surname to adapt to the local language, while others did so by personal choice. None left a record of having tried to capitalize on their relationship or use it to gain public attention. In the 1960s and 1970s, journalists attempted to locate these distant relatives. Searches in parish records, censuses, and notarial archives yielded inconclusive results. Although some families with similar surnames were identified, a direct or relevant collateral line for historical studies was never proven. Some researchers, such as the German historian Florian Beil, noted that the family structure had already been fragmented before Adolf Hitler came to power. Disputes, intermarriages, and constant relocations meant that by the mid-20th century, this network had become dispersed with no strong ties. This dispersion helped ensure that, after the war, the distant relatives remained far from the public eye. Legally, the surname Hitler was never formally banned in Germany or Austria. However, due to its social impact, some registry offices recommended those who bore it consider modifying it to avoid problems. Records show cases of surname changes, not only in Europe, but also in America and Oceania, where families opted for phonetic adaptations or partial translations. Some distant descendants faced labor or social problems when identified by genealogists, even without any public connections to Adolf Hitler. This indirect rejection is mentioned in second-hand interviews. Additionally, some local archives closed certain family data for ethical reasons, limiting access even to academic researchers. So far, there is no documented evidence that any distant relative sought to build a public figure linked to the surname, nor are there any known cases of lawsuits to claim material or symbolic rights related to the family past. Unlike other surnames associated with controversial historical figures, there were no recorded attempts to recover property confiscated by the state or to make legal claims. The story of Adolf Hitler's distant relatives remains separated, without memoirs, public statements, or descendants seeking to highlight their connection. The surname, due to its historical weight, was left behind in notarial documents, civil records, and parish archives, far from everyday life. The name Hitler still appears only in history books, academic research, and official records. No distant relative has broken the silence surrounding this vast family network, and its trace remains in old papers, forgotten records, and scattered notes, but not in the current generations. The Hitler surname in the collective memory. After the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, the surname Hitler became one of the most recognizable names in the world. Associated with Nazism, war, and violence, its impact surpassed European borders to become a global reference. No other surname of the 20th century accumulated as much negative weight, and its presence continues to persist today in historical, political, and social debates. In Germany and Austria, the surname was not formally banned, but local authorities recorded voluntary name changes by citizens with similar roots. These processes were especially visible between 1945 and 1960, when many people who had grown up during the war tried to distance themselves from any link that could bring them rejection. Archives show that dozens of people changed surnames such as Hitler, Hitler, or other similar names, despite not having a direct family relation to Adolf Hitler. In other countries, the surname was gradually withdrawn from commercial, educational, or artistic uses. Companies and brands with similar names opted to change them, and some educational institutions in Central and Eastern Europe replaced local names to avoid unwanted associations. The surname, in practice, became limited to historical records, old legal documents, and academic studies. In places like the United States, Canada, and Australia, there were cases of social rejection towards people with similar surnames, even without a family connection, reflecting the global impact of the name. This led many families, even without real connections, to decide to change their surname to avoid problems. In public memory, the surname transformed into a symbol of horror. It appeared in political debates, movies, books, and social analyses. Unlike the surnames of other 20th century leaders, Hitler did not generate local nostalgia or family movements trying to reclaim it. No direct or distant descendant tried to capitalize on it or build a visible identity from it. Direct descendants, such as the Stuart Houston brothers, kept their private lives away from the media. They did not participate in documentaries, grant interviews, or write memoirs. Their silence strengthened the decision to keep the surname out of the public spotlight in subsequent generations. The distant branches, for their part, remained detached, without prominence or records that put them in the spotlight. In academic research, the surname Hitler became the subject of genealogical, psychological, and social studies. However, these analyses always focused on the collective impact of the name, not on the private lives of the descendants. Historians and analysts refrained from delving into the intimacy of the surviving families, respecting their decision to remain reserved. Attempts to reconstruct complete family trees faced both legal and practical challenges. Closed archives, partial records, and voluntary name changes complicated the searches. Current databases and genetic analyses have allowed some branches to be traced, but so far, no confirmed results have connected living descendants to the historical core. In European schools, educational systems adapted over time the way they explained Nazism, focusing more on political and social systems than on the surname itself. This decision sought to avoid personalizing historical responsibility and to promote a broader understanding of the processes that led to the conflict. The weight of the surname remained present only in public spaces, linked to historical analyses of the 20th century and reflections on the consequences of authoritarian power and collective memory. No survivor or distant relative attempted to use it for political projects or to claim rights tied to that history. In Germany, legislation on surnames never formally prohibited the use of the surname Hitler, but requests for name changes from people with similar surnames show a clear trend. Records confirm that most of these changes were voluntary and stemmed from personal decision, not state imposition or legal obligation. Thus, the surname Hitler remains settled in history, academic studies, and cultural narratives, without continuing in private lives or in the generations that followed. Descendants chose anonymity, and distant branches remained silent, allowing the memory of the surname to remain only in historical analysis of the consequences of power and its traces. The journey through the fate of the Hitler family after World War II reveals a little-known story, laden with rejection, escape, and a chosen silence. While Europe tried to rebuild amidst material and moral ruins, both the direct and distant relatives of the former Nazi leader made definitive decisions to sever any public connection to the past. Some sought refuge in foreign countries, others adopted new names, and many deliberately disappeared from social life, carrying a surname that no one wanted to bear, neither out of pride nor simple inheritance. The central theme is built around an exceptional phenomenon, the dissolution of a lineage not by legal imposition nor external tragedies, but by a combination of fear, shame, social isolation, and the determination to erase the traces that connected them to one of the darkest names of the 20th century. The following generations, born under the weight of that past, voluntarily closed ranks, avoiding descendants, renouncing public exposure, and choosing lives that refused any form of historical protagonism. There were no attempts at reclamation or family reconstruction, only a silence that acted as a definitive closure. This story not only presents concrete facts, but also invites reflection on the private decisions that shaped the final destiny of those who once shared blood ties with Adolf Hitler. The documents, records, and fragments found over the years confirm a single direction: the conscious will to let the family line end, to distance themselves from any possibility of visible continuity, and to gradually fade into a sought-after anonymity. The case of Hitler's descendants is not merely summarized in a vanished lineage, but in the deliberate construction of a void. It is a silent disappearance, which did not arise from systematic external pressure, but from a personal choice that sealed, forever, the possibilities of keeping alive a line that, in historical terms, was rejected from within. Thus, the surname Hitler was reserved only for history books, archival documents, and academic research, while in the private realm, its last bearers chose to close the cycle forever.